Okay, I'd like to caveat that Tim really hyped me up there. So this project was actually funded by the AIC. We finished it back in June, and I got the copy edits through on the report 2 days ago. So it should be out before the end of the year if I get my finger out and do the copy editing. So the reason we came to this point, it's a really long and complicated story, and I don't really have enough time, but I'm going to give it a go. When I was doing my PhD, I focused my PhD on mental health in terrorist offenders. At the same time as doing that, I was also situated within the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre in London, 1 day a week, helping clean their data. And what I saw as I was in there was how many cases that they were physically getting in every day that they would pass off to the terrorism group and say, not our problem, even though they had significant overlap with some of the sort of motivations, some of the mental health problems, and some of the concerns that they would deal with in the fixated space. So they were dealing with people who had grievances or fixations against high-ranking public officials, the royal family. So as I was going through all this, I noticed this, and I also saw in the data that they often had people in there who there was some sort of ideology, but then there was a lot of personal grievance as well. And as all this was happening, luckily for me, because it was during my PhD, we had a fair few terrorist attacks. That sounds awful, but we did have a fair few terrorist attacks where we had individuals acting alone, where there was questions about whether they should be called a terrorist or not. And this was mainly due to their mental health status. The biggest one of these that you will all be aware of was the Sydney siege attack. And you guys had an entire inquest to decide whether he should be a terrorist or not, based on his mental health problems. And one of the outcomes from that inquest was a really strong recommendation to set up a series of fixated threat assessment centres that focus not only on the fixated, but also on people with this more mixed, unstable ideology. So that's where we come to. We also have this problem that has sort of exploded the last few years, and we're really starting to see the effects on people from what's happened with COVID. In Canberra, as around lots of other major cities in the world, we had the wonderful Freedom Brigade that turned up and were a pain in our arse for a little while. But they had very mixed, unclear ideologies that started sort of escalating into conspiracy theories. There was a lot of anti-government sentiment amongst them, a lot of anti-vaccination, personal grievances. So we're seeing an escalation in this more mixed, unclear ideologies that we're seeing in these people, which is putting pressure on the centres that are dealing with them. So the problem comes down to the fact in this terrorism arena, typically we have gone with one of two master narratives, that either a terrorist or they're mentally unwell. This is not as bad as it used to be, but when I was starting doing this research, it was either or. It was a dichotomy, you couldn't be both. And in 2016, there was a National Institute of Justice project that we ran, and we tried to compare lone acts of terrorists and mass murders. Set out with the best intentions that this would be really easy to have a control group for lone acts of terrorists, and it turned out it wasn't as easy as that. So throughout the project, we were sort of switching the offenders into the different groups, because some of them we just really weren't sure where they would fit. Elliot Rodger was a really good example of this, because was he a mass murderer, was he a terrorist? Well, actually, is he an incel? And how does that fit into mass murder and terrorism? And all these sort of really coherent groups of different offence types were starting to blur over time. And one of the things I think that's really important when we're thinking about terrorism, it's when does it become political? When do we get to the point where these personalised grievances based on lots of different issues that people go through, at what point do they become political? With the pandemic, we have seen such a rise in anti-government anti-vaccination attitudes that are coming from personal spaces, people losing their jobs, people losing members of their family, people being isolated because of all of the lockdowns we've had here in Australia. But that has become more politicised, and it's sort of now referred to as far right or extreme right, and it all gets banded into there. But at what point did that happen? So does it actually matter? Was where we started with this project. These centres that work across Australia don't really care. They'll take someone on if they're posing some sort of threat. And the definition of grievance-fuelled violence includes people who carry out hate crimes, sort of workplace attacks, school and university attacks, fatal family violence, lone acts of terrorism, incel violence, and public figure assassinations. One of the caveats that these centres have is that there has to be some sort of mental health concern in the referral, because they're a mixed team, they're policing and mental health. But if someone is referred to them who could potentially pose some sort of threat based on one of these potential outcomes, they will take them on. And as time has progressed, the sort of story of grievance started in the 1990s with some very early publications on fixated individuals. These publications were put out there because the psychiatrists and the psychologists who wanted to run the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre had to justify their being. So they did some publications, had some data, and what was happening in this data was they were pulling out different forms of mental disorder and different forms of grievance. Then as we move through, we start seeing that there was an introduction in the research about spree killers, but we were still 2001, after 9/11, terrorists are definitely normal. That was something that stuck around for a long time. Terrorists don't have mental health problems, definitely normal. There's still the very small literature on spree killings continued as we went along, and then in 2006 we had the establishment of the first FTAC. So 16 years after they published the research, they had some money and established it. As we went through time, you can see the ones in bold are the new FTACs that all started popping up, and these FTACs then merged into grievance-fuelled violence centres with the first establishment in 2015 of Project Solace up in Queensland, and this was the first centre that got turned into a grievance centre in Australia. And as we've gone further through time, we have lots of different fixated threat assessment centres that all deal with grievance. All of these centres are constantly working at getting hundreds of referrals. And this was because the risk of not doing something, and in fixation, the risk is the Queen dies or a high-ranking public official dies. There's too much of a risk of not acting. So there had to be an impetus to help these people as they go through. And when you have attacks like something like the Sydney siege, when we have an inquest, there was naturally questions about how this individual was managed because of all the different services they come into contact with. So this is why the centres exist. But the centres exist basically on goodwill and air. There really isn't any research underpinning and helping them other than the distinct sort of research areas, so the spree killer area, the terrorism area, the fixation area. So what we wanted to do is pull all this together because some of these individuals look very similar. So the starting point for this project was in the terrorism studies field, we have a real tendency to create these conceptual models of how radicalization occurs or how terrorism occurs. They're everywhere. Anyone that's studied any kind of terrorist behavior will see these all the time, and they're all different. They all have different variables in. They all say that they explain it really well. So what we wanted to do was try and see if we could build a grievance one, because practitioners love tangible outputs. Models are really good because they can sort of see a progression and it can help them in their work. So we were like, well, let's try and build one. So we started off with that. The main sticking point we had was that all of these models that exist are really theoretically and conceptually weak. They're not really underpinned by empirical evidence. So we were like, right, we're going to have to build one that's underpinned by empirical evidence and it's theoretically strong. So this paper, published in 2018, and I am not even going to attempt to pronounce that surname because I can't even pronounce my own surname half the time. These this author, did the first theoretical sort of pull together to find out what theories actually had some empirical evidence in the literature. 2018, it took us that long to get some sort of understanding of how theory works in the sort of radicalization space. And as we can see, there's some strong empirical evidence for some things. But most of these models do not contain these elements. So what we wanted to do was find all the models. So we set off to find all the models. First thing we did was we put our search string out with a load of experts and said, can you tell us if we're missing anything? And of course, because they're experts, said, yes, you're missing all this stuff. So we put that in and we had over 1 million hits. And I was like, nope, we're not doing that. So we cut them down. And then we cut them down again. And then we ended up with 74,000 papers. And then once we'd sort of narrowed it down, taken it through, read all the papers, found all the models, there was 99 different models. And within those models, or across those models, there were 786 different variables, so different risk factors, if you like. So then we went back to our experts, and we were like, you've got to help us with this, because I'm not putting all of these in a code book. We spoke to a series of experts again, and showed them this massive big spreadsheet, and they helped us cut it down. So we ended up with 78 questions. So we got rid of a lot. And we wanted to know which variables or risk factors were really important in their jobs. What did they see? So we had the code book, which was great. We then had to go and find a load of offenders from all these different categories. And we found 120 different offenders from Australia, New Zealand, Europe, US, Canada, and the UK. And they had either conducted and been convicted of or conducted and died in a series of forms of crime, all under the sort of banner of grievance. And we had 3 coders. There was myself, Helen Taylor, and then my poor honours student, who now I have really, really cruelly convinced to do a PhD. And so we went through and we coded all of these actors. And we found that there were a certain amount of the variables or the risk factors that were connected in some way, in terms of they were in some way, overall, they predicted an outcome of grievance development. But as you can see, there's only really one that was really strongly predictive, and that was the expression of wanting to commit an act of revenge. So we then went through and were like, right, if we're doing this, we've got to do this properly. We're not just going to do some sort of static evaluation and then give a list of risk factors to the practitioners, because why do that? It's been done before. So when we had all of these variables, we ran them through a series of interactions, because it's not just that all variables produce one outcome. They interact in different ways. And I haven't put them all on the screen because there's a load of interactions that were highly significant. But they'll be in the report and they look quite pretty, so you should download it and read it. But there were things like the experience of instability was moderated by being prejudiced against. So it actually made having early life instability and then prejudice actually meant someone was more likely to develop grievance later down the line. So it was things like that we went through. Once we'd done all these interactions, I was like, right, now we can get to the fun part. And we temporarily ordered all of the variables for each individual offender to figure out in what order they appeared, so that our model actually had some sort of empirical process to it rather than just a drawn one. And we came up with this. So what this essentially means is this is the overall process. If the process was perfect, there'd be a 1 between each of the different boxes in the flowchart, but it's not perfect because everyone experienced a different way that their process ran. But for every single person that we looked at, these were important factors going forward. And if you think about when I said revenge was really highly predictive, it's because it was the last thing to happen before someone said, right, I'm ready to act. So that's why it was the only one that was predictive, because it was the last thing. But if you look at it, it wouldn't have happened unless you'd have had the experiences of prejudice, anger, preoccupation with something, being socially rejected, having a deterioration going on, having early life instability, having emotional problems. So that's what we came to after a year and reading all those papers. And I apologise because I'm 15 minutes in and I am done. So the report will be out soon. There'll be a trends and issues as well, which is much shorter, but the full report will have all the interactions in. So the idea of this is to give it to the grievance-fuelled violence centres so they can have some utility in it. I actually had an email from the Victoria one the other day and was like, is it ready yet? Can we have it? So, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.